The life of Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson is known as one of America's founding fathers, the main author of the Declaration of Independence, and the third President of the United States. These are some of his most known accomplishments, but there is so much more to add to his story. Thomas Jefferson was born on April 13, 1743, on Shadwell Plantation near Charlotte, Virginia. Thomas Jefferson's father was Peter Jefferson, who was a planter and surveyor on his plantation. Jefferson's mother was Jane Randolph Jefferson, who was a descendant of a prominent Virginia family. Thomas was the third child of 10 children that Peter and Jane had. At 16, Jefferson started the College of William and Mary in Williamsburg, Virginia. He studied math, philosophy, and practiced violin there. During his days in college, he spent all his hours doing something productive. His two main teachers that he looked up to were William Small and George Wythe. After he graduated in 1762, he continued to study law with Wythe. He studied law from 1762 to 1767. Then he left the university to practice representing small-scale farmers and planters from the western countries in cases involving land titles and claims. After he began practicing as a lawyer in 1767, he became a member of the colonial Virginia House of Burgesses from 1769 to 1775. During his time as a member, he supported resolutions opposing Parliament's authority. Many people admired this quality of his. By the 1770s, his image was starting to gain popularity. In 1768, Jefferson began work to prepare for a new building on the property that would eventually be known as Monticello, which is a little mountain in Italian. Jefferson designed the home himself. The Monticello plantation consisted of 5,000 acres of land that was built upon a mountain near Shadwell, Virginia. At Monticello, Jefferson kept a log of everything that would happen, from the weather and gardening to notes about his slaves and animals that he owned. On January 1, 1772, Jefferson married Martha Wales Skelton, who was previously a widow before she remarried. By marrying Martha, Jefferson's holdings more than doubled in land and slaves. They had 6 children together that they raised on the Monticello plantation. Out of the 6, only 2 of their daughters survived past childhood. Of the 2, their names are Martha and Mary. Jefferson was on the border of whether slavery was right or not. Even though he supported individual liberty, and at one point he promoted a plan for gradual emancipation of slaves in America, he still owned slaves throughout his life. He promoted the fact that slavery was wrong, but he owned slaves before, which is a hypocritical response. During the 1760s and 70s, he wanted to end the slave trade since Virginian plantations already had enough slaves, which is not a moral reasoning to end the slave trade. On March 27, 1775, Jefferson was selected as a delegate to the Second Continental Congress during the American Revolutionary War. Before writing the Declaration of Independence, a 5-member committee met up on June 11, 1776, to discuss writing about why the 13 colonies wanted to separate themselves from British rule and the importance of individual rights and freedoms. This committee consisted of Benjamin Franklin, Roger Sherman, Robert R. Livingston, John Adams, and Thomas Jefferson. The Declaration of Independence went into effect on July 4, 1776, and is one of the most important documents in American history. One of the most famous quotes from the Declaration of Independence is, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that we are endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed." This is one of the only parts of the original Declaration of Independence, the original draft Declaration of Independence, that Congress decided to leave in. This quote has been used in many liberal movements in American history. After writing the Declaration of Independence in the fall of 1776, Jefferson resigned from the Continental Congress and was re-elected to the Virginia House of Delegates and served a 3-year term. During his time as a member, he proposed the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, which he wrote in the late 1770s and was passed in 1786. The Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom made efforts towards the First Amendment of the Constitution, which protects people's rights to worship as they choose. From June 2nd to 1779 to June 3rd, 1781, Jefferson served as the governor of Virginia. Under his leadership, a surprise British invasion in 1780 left the state of Virginia defenseless. After Martha died in September 6 of 1782, the combination of her death and the previous British invasion occurred in 1780 caused him to have major grief, and he vowed that he would never leave his family again for his country. He later broke this promise and agreed to serve as a delegate in the Continental Congress in December of 1782. Jefferson served in the Continental Congress from 1783 to 1784. His major input during his service was to say that Western territories should be able to enter the Union with just as much power as the states that were originally in the 13 colonies. From May 17, 1784 to 1789, Jefferson served as the Minister of France, replacing Benjamin Franklin because he wanted to get away from Monticello because it reminded him of Martha. Since Jefferson was the ambassador of America in France, this meant that he couldn't attend the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia in the summer of 1787, but he was kept informed of the proceedings of the draft to draft a new national constitution, and later advocated for including a Bill of Rights and presidential term limits. Before Jefferson left for America in 1789, Jefferson thought the French Revolution wasn't going to be a big thing to worry about, but in reality it caused major chaos throughout France. Luckily, he was able to leave France in 1789. Jefferson returned to America in the fall of 1789. George Washington chose Jefferson to become the new nation's first Secretary of State. He worked with Alexander Hamilton, who was the nation's Secretary of Treasury. They discussed about foreign policies that they would plan to add to the nation's government, and they made different interpretations of the U.S. Constitution. Jefferson's main concern was the absence of the Bill of Rights in the Constitution. He was less interested in dividing the powers of government and identifying those regions where government could not intrude. Jefferson served as the Vice President of the United States from 1797 to 1801, under John Adams as President. Jefferson ran in the election of 1796 against John Adams, but received the second most votes, making him the automatic Vice President. In 1800, Jefferson ran against Adams for the second time and won presidency. On March 4, 1801, Jefferson was sworn into office as the first president to be inaugurated into office in Washington, D.C. Aaron Burr was his vice president. Jefferson was the third president of the United States and served for 2 terms. One of Jefferson's most important actions that he first made as president was the Louisiana Purchase. This territory consisted of 820,000 square miles that extended between the Mississippi River and Rocky Mountains in the Gulf of Mexico to present-day Canada. The territory was purchased on April 30, 1803 from France for $15 million. It nearly doubled the size of the U.S. The Notes of the State of Virginia was a travel guide and scientific treatise and a philosophical meditation. Jefferson wrote this in the fall of 1781, but an unauthorized version was published when he only agreed to a French edition. These notes contain extensive discussion about slavery, and he also explained what he believes the difference between blacks and whites are. This exposed his inner thoughts about his racist mind that most Virginians like him had. This document proved all the speculations about his racist mind to be true. Although Jefferson believes that slavery was a gross violation of the principles celebrated in the Declaration of Independence, he also believed that people of African descent were biologically inferior to whites and could never live alongside whites in peace and harmony. His mounting indebtedness rendered all thought superfluous towards the end, because his slaves, like all his possessions, were mortgaged to his creditors, and therefore not really free. In conclusion, he never freed all his slaves from his consent. After he died, they were sold off. Around 1802, it was found out that Jefferson had an affair with Sally Hemings, a slave owned by Jefferson himself. In 1788, they had several children together. The public found out about his relationship through one journalist that wanted to ruin Jefferson's political career. In 1804, Jefferson ran against Charles Pinckney from South Carolina and won. George Clinton served as his vice president. In the second term, Jefferson wanted to keep America more out of Europe's Napoleonic warfares. For what was supposed to be Jefferson's third term as president, he chose not to run, and instead James Madison succeeded him as president. After his presidency, he decided to live a peaceful life on his plantation in Monticello, where he continued to work on his hobbies such as architecture, music reading, and gardening. Jefferson loved to read. He read everything from classic literature to political works, and collected thousands of books in his lifetime. At one point, he had in his possession more than 6,500 books in his personal library, but after the British burned the Library of Congress in 1814, he sold 6,000 of his books to the library to help restart their collection. Jefferson later helped in the creation of the University of Virginia. Jefferson helped design the school's building and its education system, and made sure that there was no religious affiliation or religious requirements to attend the school. The university was founded on January 25, 1819, and is located in Charlottesville, Virginia. On July 4, 1826, Thomas Jefferson died at the age of 83 at his home in Monticello. Jefferson was buried at Monticello. After he died, all the debt that he had to his name was paid off by selling his mansion, furnishing, and slaves that he owned. Eventually, Monticello Plantation was acquired by a non-profit organization which opened its doors publicly in 1954. Thomas Jefferson is known as one of the most important people in America because he helped shape the early development of American history and for defending human liberty. Today, Jefferson is remembered in many different ways. The Thomas Jefferson Memorial is located in Washington, D.C., and has famous quotes that he says written all around the inside of the building. He's found on the nickel, the $2 bill, and his face was carved into Mount Rushmore.